I have collected a variety of puzzle pieces about different places that bring a bigger picture into focus that is not immediately apparent on the surface over the course of several years of doing extensive research. I looked at the foreign involvement and the development of Japan's military empire of the late 19th century to the mid-20th century in our historical narrative, and in its being dismantled in my last video. In this video, I'm going to be looking into the East India Companies, the theft of India, and the legacy of the Mughal Empire. My name is Michelle Gibson. Most of the research in this video came from a 23-part series on sacred geometry, ley lines, and places in alignment that I did back in 2020, tracking a long-distance alignment beginning in San Francisco, in which I crossed through this part of the world twice, though I did augment my original findings with new research to illustrate what took place according to our historical narrative. India was called the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, and its largest and most important overseas possession. Much of the British Empire was built around India in order to provide routes to or protection for India. India was prosperous and rich in spices, silk, indigo, gold, cotton, and other products and resources. Trade with and eventual political dominance of large parts of India was what provided Britain with large parts of its wealth in the 1700s through 1900s. But how exactly did this happen? I will be exploring answers to this question in this video. The historical Mughal Empire occupied what corresponds to the modern countries in South Asia of India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Bangladesh. I'm going to begin this video on the theft of India and the legacy of the Mughal Empire with the first of the East India Companies of Europe, the British East India Company. The British East India Company held a monopoly granted to it by Queen Elizabeth I of England in 1600 between South Africa's Cape of Good Hope and Tierra del Fuego's Cape Horn at the southern tip of South America, until 1834 when the monopoly was lost. It was initially formed to trade in the Indian Ocean region with the East Indies, which was the Indian subcontinent in Southeast Asia, seized control of large parts of the Indian subcontinent, and ruled the beginnings of the British Empire in India. Its three presidency armies totaled an estimated 260,000 soldiers, twice the size of the British Army at the time. It ceased operations on June 1st of 1874 when it was dissolved. The British East India Company ruled over parts of the Indian subcontinent between 1757 and 1858, commencing after the 1757 Battle of Plassey, called a decisive victory over the hereditary Nawab of Bengal, and this was considered to be the start of British imperialism in India and a key step in the eventual British domination of vast areas there. The British East India Company first arrived in India at Madras in 1600, making it their principal settlement, and we are told constructed Fort St. George in 1644. Madras has been known as Chennai since 1996. The British East India Company was said to have come here in order to have a port close to the Malaccan Straits, the main shipping channel between the Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean, and to secure its trade lines and commercial interests in the spice trade. It is one of the most important shipping lanes in the world. They succeeded in securing their goals as the British East India Company obtained the Prince of Wales Island in the Malaccan Strait. Prince of Wales Island is known today as Penang Island, the main constituent island of the Malaysian state of Penang. Apparently, the British East India Company was able to successfully take what they named the Prince of Wales Island from the Kedah Sultanate in 1786, which became the capital of the Straits Settlement, a group of British territories in Southeast Asia established in 1826, including Malacca and Singapore. The Kedah Sultanate was an historical Muslim dynasty located in the Malay Peninsula, said to have dated as an independent state from 1136 AD. Its monarchy was abolished with the formation of the Malayan Union in 1909, but was restored and added to the Federation of Malaya in 1963. The Madras Presidency, or the Presidency of Fort St. George, was an administrative subdivision of British India and established in 1652. At its greatest extent, the Madras Presidency included most of southern India, including the whole of the states of Tamil Nadu and Andhra Pradesh, parts of Odisha, Kerala, and Karnataka, and the Union Territory of Lakshadweep, a group of islands off India's southwestern coast, and the northern part of Ceylon, called Sri Lanka since 1972. The Madras Presidency ended with the advent of Indian independence on August 15th of 1947. Elihu Yale became president of the Madras Presidency in 1684. Elihu Yale was a British merchant, trader, and a president of the British East India Company settlement at Fort St. George, who later became a benefactor of the collegiate school in the colony of Connecticut, which in 1718 was renamed Yale College in his honor. As a noteworthy aside, the Skull and Bones Society was founded as an undergraduate senior secret student society at Yale in 1832. The Palk Bay and Palk Strait, separating the southern end of the Tamil Nadu state and northern Sri Lanka, were named for Sir Robert Palk, an officer in the British East India Company who served as the president of the Madras Presidency between 1755 and 1763. Under the provisions of Pitt's India Act, which brought the East India Company's rule in India under the control of the British government, Madras became one of the 3 provinces established by the British East India Company, whose leader became governor instead of president, because the Governor-General in Calcutta, the monarch's representative, became the superior office of authority. William Petrie was an officer in the British East India Company in Madras in the 1780s. An amateur astronomer, he was given the credit for making the first modern astronomical observations outside of Europe in Madras in 1786. We are told his home observatory and instruments contributed to the first modern observatory outside of Europe, the Madras Observatory, shown here, said to have been built around 1792, with the first observations on the meridian being in 1793, said to have been designed by Michael Topping, the chief marine surveyor of Fort St. George in Madras. The Madras Observatory was described as having a single room that was 40 feet or 12 meters long and 20 feet or 6 meters wide, with a 15-foot or 5-meter high ceiling, as well as a granite pillar weighing 10 tons or 9 metric tons in the center of the room. Seriously? A 10-ton granite pillar? Well, the granite pillar still exists in the present day, with an engraving by those said to have erected it. Could some kind of sandblasting technology been used on an already existing granite pillar? At any rate, this massive granite pillar is found on the grounds of the present-day Regional Meteorological Center in Chennai, though the original building of the Madras Observatory no longer exists. Another observatory in South India is the Kodai Solar Observatory. Located in the Palani Hills southwest of Vellore in Tamil Nadu state. Founded in April of 1899, legend has it that the observatory's 6-inch telescope was said to have been brought on foot by 4 men who climbed steep valleys and braved the attack of wild animals, carrying the telescope on their shoulders for almost 3 months. It is interesting to note that there are abandoned observatories dotting the landscape of the hills behind Kodai Canal. Vedic astronomy has ancient roots in India, going back at the very least thousands of years. Yet they want us to believe the British East India Company brought the science of astronomy to India. Here are some other historical events that were said to have taken place during the time period of the Madras Presidency. Nandidurg, an ancient hilltop fortress in Karnataka state's Nandi Hills, was at one time believed to have been impregnable, but was successfully stormed by the army of General Charles Cornwallis in 1791, the first Marquess of Cornwallis in the Third Anglo-Mysore War, a conflict in South India between the British East India Company and the Kingdom of Mysore, and the same General Cornwallis famous for being defeated at the Battle of Yorktown in 1781 and being forced to surrender, basically ending the American Revolutionary War. In spite of his loss and surrender to the Americans in the Revolutionary War, Cornwallis was knighted in 1786, and in the same year became the British Governor-General and Commander-in-Chief in India. The Nandi Hills later became a resort for British Raj officials during the hot season. The Kingdom of Mysore was said to have been founded in 1399, and was a princely state from 1799 to 1950, and in direct control by the British starting in 1831. Mysore was said to be considered among the more developed and urbanized regions of India. There were altogether 4 Anglo-Mysore wars between the Kingdom of Mysore and the British East Indies Madras Presidency and neighboring kingdoms fighting against Mysore. After the Fourth Anglo-Mysore War in 1799, Mysore was dismantled to the benefit of the British East India Company in the process of taking control of much of the Indian subcontinent. The first significant rebellion against British rule erupted at Vellore Fort in 1806, known as the Vellore Mutiny or Vellore Sepoy Mutiny. While it only lasted 1 day, it was the first instance of a large-scale and violent mutiny by Indian sepoys against the British East India Company. The sepoys, Indian soldiers fighting under European orders, seized the Vellore fort and killed or wounded 200 British soldiers, but the mutiny was subdued by the end of the day by cavalry and artillery from another nearby British unit. This pillar at Hazrath Makhan Junction in Vellore commemorates the 1806 Vellore Mutiny. The Vellore Fort is known for its grand ramparts, wide moat, and robust masonry. The fort's ownership was said to have passed from the Carnatic Empire to the Bijapur Sultans, to the Marathas, to the Carnatic Nawabs, and finally to the British, who held the fort until India gained independence in 1947. More about what that independence from Great Britain actually looked like later in this video. The Kingdom of Kandy was said to have been founded in 1469. This map is described to be that of Sri Lanka in the 1520s, known previously as Ceylon. In 1592, Kandy became the capital city of the last remaining independent kingdom in Ceylon after the coast regions had been conquered by the Portuguese. From that time, the Kingdom of Kandy kept the Portuguese and Dutch East India Company at bay, but succumbed finally to British colonial rule when the kingdom was absorbed into the British Empire as a protectorate via the Kangin Convention of 1815, an agreement signed between the British and members of the King's Court, which ceded the kingdom's territory to British rule, and the last king was imprisoned. Ceylon was a British protectorate until its independence in 1948, and the name of the country was changed to Sri Lanka when it became a republic in 1972. The last king of Kandy in Ceylon was Sri Wikrama Raja Singh. He was arrested by the British in 1815, and in January of 1816, he and his families were sent to the Madras Presidency on the HMS Cornwallis, the same ship on which the Treaty of Nanjing, or Nanking, between the British Empire and China would be signed after China's defeat after the First Opium War in 1842. The Muthu Mandapam, or Pearl Hall, located on the banks of the Palar River in the Tamil Nadu state's city of Vellore, is the resting place of the last king of Kandy in Ceylon, and a place where Sri Lankans today journey in order to pay their respects to him. The Kangin Convention was signed in the Temple of the Sacred Tooth Relic. Also known simply as the Temple of the Tooth, it houses the tooth of the Buddha, venerated as the Buddha's only surviving relic. It was believed that whoever holds the relic holds the governance of the country. The Temple of the Tooth, or Sri Dalada Malagawa, is part of the royal palace complex of the former Kingdom of Kandy, located on a canal. Extending from Kandy Lake, also known as the Kiri Mahuda, or Sea of Milk, an artificial lake, and said to have been built next to the Temple of the Tooth by the last king of Kandy in 1807. After the kingdom's downfall, the royal palace of Kandy became the residence for the primary British agent, and nowadays is a museum of archaeology. Next, I'm going to mention the Dutch East India Company and its connection to Mughal Bengal. On March 20th, 1602, the Dutch East India Company was chartered to trade with India and Southeast Asian countries when the Dutch government granted it a 21-year monopoly for the Dutch spice trade, also known as the VOC, or Verenigde Oostindische Company. It was chartered as a company to trade primarily with Mughal Suba, or Mughal Bengal, which includes modern Bangladesh and the West Bengal state of modern India. It has often been labeled a trading or shipping company, but was in fact a proto-conglomerate, diversifying into multiple commercial and industrial activities, such as international trade, shipbuilding, production, and trade of East Indian spices, Indonesian coffee, Formosan or Taiwanese sugarcane, and South African wine. The first formally listed public company by widely issuing shares of stocks and bonds to the general public in the early 1600s. It was the world's most valuable company of all time, with a worth of $7.9 trillion. It is considered by many to have been the forerunner of modern corporations. Chartered to trade primarily with Mughal Bengal, from where 50% of textiles and 80% of silks were imported, Mughal Bengal was described as a paradise of nations, and its inhabitants' living standards were among the highest in the world at one time. And for comparison, a typical photo of the poverty found in Bangladesh today. The borders of the country of Bangladesh were the major portion of the historic region of Bengal, an ancient civilization dating back at least 4,000 years. The presidency of Fort William was first established in Calcutta in 1699. Calcutta, or Kolkata today, is the capital and largest city of what is now the Indian state of West Bengal and the largest Bengali-speaking city after Dhaka, the capital of Bangladesh. Interesting to note that Kolkata is the only city in India with a public tram service that is still in operation. We are told that tram transport in India was established in the late 19th century by the British, and that between the 1930s and 1960s, the other acknowledged electric tram services in Madras, Kanpur, Delhi, and Bombay were discontinued. In Dhaka, this building is what is called the Pink Palace, or Asan Manzil, and was the official palace and seat of the Nawab of Dhaka, with construction of it said to have been started in 1859 and completed in 1872. The Pink Palace in Dhaka is described as having been constructed in the Indo-Saracenic Revival architecture style, also known as Indo-Gothic, Mughal Gothic, and Hindu style, and was said to have been utilized by British architects in India in the later 19th century, especially in public and government buildings. This is the Kamalapur train station in Dhaka, with its gigantic archways. It was said to have been designed and opened in the 1960s. The railroad is an important mode of transportation in Bangladesh. Dhaka was one of several places given the nickname Venice of the East. This is a painting of Dhaka that was dated as 1861. We are told that there are three major canal systems in Bangladesh that drain into the three major rivers around Dhaka, the Turag, the Balu, and the Burraganja rivers. This is what the Kalyanpur Canal looks like today. Lal Bagh Fort in Dhaka was said to be an incomplete 17th century fort complex, with work starting on it said to have begun in 1678. The main buildings of the complex consist of the mosque, what is called the tomb or mausoleum of Bibi Pari, and the Diwan-e-Am. Below the Diwan-e-Am in this picture, it looks like there might be a megalithic wall, but it is hard to tell for sure, and I can't find a better picture than this of what shows up there. The Bengal presidency emerged from trading posts established in Mughal Bengal starting in 1612 in the reign of the Mughal Emperor Jahangir. This portrait of Jahangir, with the radiant halo around his head, is not only typical of other portraits of Jahangir, it was typical of other Mughal emperors as well. The Mughals were Sufis, facts about both of which have been greatly obscured in the historical narrative. Who are the Sufis? Mystics and practitioners of the inward dimension of Islam. Sufism emphasizes personal experience with the divine and concentrating one's energy on spiritual development. Back to Bengal. During the 18th century, the Nawabs of Bengal were among the wealthiest rulers in the world and governed as independent monarchs within the Mughal Empire, though they contributed the largest share of funds to the imperial treasury in Delhi. Bengal Suba became the base for not only the British and Dutch East India Companies, but for other European trading companies as well, the French East India Company, the Danish East India Company, the Austrian East India Company, and the Ostend Company. In 1757, the British East India Company overthrew the hereditary Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Daulah, in the Battle of Plassey. The Nawab's defeat was made possible by the defection of his commander-in-chief, Mir Jafar, and several others. As a reward for his defection, Mir Jafar was installed as the first dependent Nawab of Bengal of the British East India Company, who in turn ceded revenues to what was called the Company. This marked the beginning of company rule in India and its expansion across India, and by the mid-19th century, the paramount political and military power. The Bengal Presidency, also known as the Presidency of Fort William, stretched all the way across northern India at one time. Where one of the earliest railways said to have been constructed in India was the Solani Aqueduct Railway in 1851, which we are told was built for the purposes of transporting construction materials for the Solani River Aqueduct. Proby Cotley, an English engineer and paleontologist, and an officer in the British East India Company, was given the historical credit not only for the building of the Solani Aqueduct, but also the 350-mile or 563-kilometer Ganges Canal between 1843 and 1854, which the aqueduct crosses, said to have had the greatest discharge of any irrigation canal in the world at the time of its construction, and described as an engineering marvel. The Bengal Presidency ultimately became the economic, cultural, and educational hub of the British Raj, the name given to the rule of the British Crown in India between 1858 and 1947, and its governor was concurrently the Viceroy of India for many years. In 1905, Bengal proper was partitioned, separating largely Muslim eastern areas from largely Western Hindu areas. In 1912, British India was reorganized, and the Bengal Presidency was reunited with a single Bengali-speaking province. This first partitioning of Bengal seems to have been a human and social engineering project and a practice run for the 1947 boundary partition of India. The partition of India in 1947 divided British India into the Union of India and the Dominion of Pakistan along religious lines, displacing 10 to 12 million people and creating overwhelming refugee crises in the newly constituted dominions, as well as large-scale violence. It involved the division of two provinces, Punjab and Bengal, based on district-wise non-Muslim or Muslim majorities, and resulted in the dissolution of the British Raj. More on this later. The third of the three presidencies in India was the Bombay Presidency. We are told that Bombay was ceded by Portugal as part of the dowry for Princess Catherine of Braganza upon her marriage to King Charles II in 1662, and in 1668 it was transferred to the British East India Company. In 1674, the part of western India where we find Bombay was part of the Maratha Empire, which was established that year under the leadership of Shivaji when the Marathas ended Mughal control of the subcontinent. The Mughal emperor at that time, Aurangzeb, was also a Sufi. The tomb of Aurangzeb, considered the last of the strong Mughal emperors, is a short distance from the rock-cut Alora Cave temple complex in Kuldabad. His burial site is located on the complex of the Dargah, or shrine, of Sheikh Zainuddin, a Sufi saint of the Deccan, also known as Deccan, of India, and the spiritual and religious teacher of Aurangzeb. As a matter of fact, Kuldabad is popularly known as the Valley of the Saints because several Sufi saints resided there in the 14th century. At any rate, the first of three Anglo-Maratha wars between the British East India Company and the Maratha Empire started in 1775. Lasting 7 years, it was considered a defeat for the British East India Company and ended with the Treaty of Salbai in May of 1782, with terms favorable to both parties. After the Treaty of Salbai, there were 20 years of peace between the two. The 5 Maratha chiefs, however, were engaged in internal quarrels between themselves, and one of them, Baji Rao II of the Scindia, fled to the British East India Company for protection after the 1802 Battle of Poona, where his army was defeated, which was a battle between rival factions of the Scindia and the Holkars within the Maratha Empire. Baji Rao II signed the Treaty of Bassein with the British East India Company, in which he ceded land for the maintenance of a subsidiary force and agreed to make no treaties with any other power. This solved his immediate problem, but other Maratha chiefs were not happy about the situation, and this led to the start of the Second Anglo-Maratha War in August of 1803. British troops captured the walled town of the Petah of Ahmednagar on August 8th and the Ahmednagar fort on August 12th. Arthur Wellesley was one of the British commanders of these troops. He later became famous as the Duke of Wellington, one of the commanders who defeated Napoleon at Waterloo, ending the Napoleonic Wars, and he was Prime Minister of Great Britain twice. Interesting. Could Arthur Wellesley and Napoleon both been Freemasons? Perhaps something like they were playing both ends against the middle. Back to India and the Second Anglo-Maratha War. British forces continued on victorious in battle with different Maratha clans. By October of 1803, the British had captured Assaghar Fort near Delhi. The Maratha clans continued to lose their lands in one treaty after another. with all of them being defeated and losing territory by the end of the Second Anglo-Maratha War in December of 1805. The Third Anglo-Maratha War from November of 1817 to April of 1819 resulted in the decimation of the Maratha armies. British victories were swift, and by the end of the war, the British East India Company had taken control, in one form or another, of all of the Maratha territories. Then there was the Punjab and the Sikhs. The Punjab is a historical region of South Asia and the northern part of the Indian subcontinent, and was the cradle of the ancient Indus River Valley civilization, which was largely in modern Pakistan. Lahore is the capital city of the Punjab province of Pakistan. The walled city of Lahore, also known as the Old City, forms the historic core of Lahore, and was the capital of the Mughal Empire at one time. Here's a view of the walled imperial city of Lahore on the left, showing what looks to be very similar to a star city configuration, like the example of another imperial city, Hue, in Vietnam, on the right. The Great Exhibition of the Works of All Nations, held in the Crystal Palace Exhibition in 1851, was also known as the Great Shalimar, which was a reference to the Mughal Garden complex in Lahore. Both places, at the Lahore Mughal Gardens and on the 1851 Great Exhibition brochure, have 8 pointed stars and similar design patterns. Lahore Fort passed to the British when they annexed the Punjab region following their victory over the Sikhs at the Battle of Gujarat in February of 1859. The Battle of Gujarat was part of the Second Anglo-Sikh War, a military conflict between the Sikhs and the British East India Company. The Second Anglo-Sikh War took place between 1848 and 1849. This is what we are told. The Sikh Empire had replaced the Mughal Empire in the Punjab when the Sikh Maharaja Ranjit Singh captured Lahore in 1799, and it was the last major region on the Indian subcontinent to be annexed by the British. The First Anglo-Sikh War was fought between the Sikhs and the British East India Company in 1845 and 1846. The Sikhs lost the war and as a result ceded Jammu and Kashmir to the British as a princely state, as a tributary state to the British. The Second Anglo-Sikh War resulted in the dissolution of the Sikh Empire into princely states and into the British province of Punjab, and eventually a lieutenant governorship was formed in Lahore as a direct representative of the British Crown. We are told the Indus River Valley civilization flourished in the basins of the Indus River between 3300 and 1300 BC, which originates on the Tibetan Plateau near Mount Kailash and ultimately flows along the entire length of Pakistan to the Arabian Sea. The ancient civilization that flourished here was also known as the Harappan civilization, after Harappa, considered the type or model site of the civilization. Harappa was on the Ravi River, southwest of Lahore. There is said to be a legacy railroad station in the modern village of Harappa, dating from the British Raj, on the Lahore-Multan Railway, construction of which was said to have begun in 1855. The discovery of Harappa, and soon afterwards Mohenjo-Daro, was said to be the culmination of work beginning in 1861 with the founding of the Archaeological Survey of India during the British Raj. Mohenjo-Daro was one of the largest cities of the ancient Harappan civilization of the Indus River Valley and is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, said to have been built starting in 2500 BC and one of the world's earliest major cities. Here's the thing about the cities of the Harappan civilization. They were known for their urban planning, baked brick houses, elaborate drainage systems, water supply systems, clusters of large non-residential buildings, and metallurgy. I even read where they had streetlights and an extremely accurate system of weights and measures. Between 3300 and 1300 BC, a major uprising took place in northern India between 1857 and 1859 against the rule of the British East India Company and was ultimately unsuccessful. The last Mughal emperor in India, Bahadur Shah Zafar, also a devout Sufi, was deposed by the British East India Company in 1858 and exiled to Rangoon in Burma. Through the Government of India Act of 1858, the British Crown assumed direct control of the British East India Company held territories in India in the form of the new British Raj. The Criminal Tribes Act was first passed by the British colonial government in 1871. It criminalized entire communities by designating them as habitual criminals, and restrictions on their movements were imposed, including men having to report to the police once per week. By 1874, the British East India Company was officially dissolved as a result of the 1873 East India Stock Dividend Redemption Act passed by Parliament after its liquidation had been set in motion by the 1858 Government of India Act, at which time the company's governmental responsibilities were formally transferred to the British Crown. Interesting to note that this 10 ounces of silver commemorating the East India Company that was minted in 2021 on the Little British Overseas Territory in the South Atlantic Ocean of the island of St. Helena has ley lines showing on it. Older maps like those of the Catalan Atlas show ley lines, but they started to go away with the maps and globes of Gerardus Mercator in the mid to late 1500s. In 1876, Queen Victoria assumed the title of Empress of India. King Emperor and Queen Empress were the titles used by the British monarchs in India between 1876 and 1948. As one example that I know of, the Criminal Tribes Act was used to take down the ruling tribe of what is Udaipur state in Rajasthan in northern India. The city of Udaipur, also known as the City of the Lakes, also had the nickname of Venice of the East. The Bil Minas, one of the oldest communities in India and inhabitants of the ancient Indus River Valley civilization, are today among the most economically deprived peoples of India. As a matter of fact, the ruins of Balathal in the Udaipur district were from what was connected to the Ahar Banas culture of the Harappans of the Indus River Valley, one of at least 90 Ahar culture sites in the basins of the Ahar and Banas rivers, and where the skeletal remains of a 2,700-year-old yogi were found, sitting in a state of what is called samadhi, a meditative consciousness in which human consciousness becomes one with cosmic consciousness. The Bilmanas tribe was the ruling tribe before the Kachawa clan of Rajputs, otherwise known as the Mewar Kingdom, forced them to hide out in the Aravalli hills surrounding Udaipur, and they were named a criminal tribe by the British government in 1924 to keep them from regaining power over the Rajputs. They were subsequently given protection as a scheduled tribe after the upliftment in 1949 of the Criminal Tribe Act, which had been enacted on October 12th of 1871. A scheduled tribe is recognized by the Indian Constitution, has political representation, and yet they are legally totally or partially excluded from various types of services important for leading a healthy life. And altogether, the scheduled tribes of India make up almost 10% of the population and are considered India's poorest people. Delhi is an ancient city and the seat of the Mughal Empire. New Delhi was said to have been built by the British between 1911 and 1931, after the laying of the foundation stone by King Emperor George V of India during the Delhi Durbar of 1911, an Indian imperial-style mass assembly organized by the British at Coronation Park to mark his accession as Emperor of India. The Gateway of India in Mumbai, the former Bombay, was said to have been erected starting in 1913 to commemorate the landing in December of 2011 of King Emperor George V and Queen Empress Mary at the Apollo Bunder Pier. Amritsar in India's Punjab state is only 51 miles or 31 kilometers from Lahore. Amritsar is the home to the Harminder Sahib, or the Abode of God, otherwise known as the Golden Temple, where it sits on an artificial island in the middle of a perfectly square, definitely man-made looking water configuration. For Sikhs, it is the holiest Gurdwara, a place of assembly and worship, and most important pilgrimage site, with construction initiated in 1581 by Guru Ram Das, the fourth of the 10 gurus of Sikhism, and founder of the holy city of Amritsar in Sikh tradition. The Jallianwala Bagh in Amritsar, an historic garden and memorial of national importance located in the vicinity of the Golden Temple complex, was the location of the famous massacre in Amritsar in 1919. When a British commander ordered troops of the British Indian Army to fire their rifles into a crowd of unarmed civilians during a festival time, killing at least 400 and injuring over 1,000. Some historians considered the massacre at Jallianwala Bagh a decisive step towards the end of British rule in India. As previously mentioned, the partition of India in 1947 divided British India into the Hindu-majority Union of India and the Muslim-majority Dominion of Pakistan. displaced 10 to 12 million people in forced mass migrations to the newly constituted dominions, and created overwhelming refugee crises, as well as large-scale violence, thereby establishing the conditions for suspicion and hostility between these two countries that has existed into the present day. This movement of people started right after India's official Independence Day from Great Britain on August 15th of 1947. So much for the nonviolent independence movement Mahatma Gandhi had led for 25 years prior, and Gandhi himself was assassinated on January 30th of 1948. What was the fate of India's princely states that did not initially get absorbed into the new Union of India in the 1947 partition? This is a view of the Salar Jung Museum in Hyderabad, showing masonry banks on the Musi River. The Salar Jung Museum is described as having the largest collection of antiques belonging to a single person, said to have been sourced from the Nawab Mir Yusuf Ali Khan Salar Jung III, former Prime Minister of the 7th Nizam, the title of the ruler of what was then the princely state of Hyderabad. The palace owned by the Nizam of Hyderabad, the Faluknuma Palace, was said to have been built in 1893 and converted into a five-star hotel in 2010. As well, it houses a large collection of the Nizam of Hyderabad's treasures, including furniture, paintings, statues, books, and manuscripts. The official residence of the Nizams of Hyderabad was Chalmahala Palace, said to have been built starting in 1750. The Golconda Fort in Hyderabad is described as a 12th century citadel with 4 forts, 87 bastions, and numerous buildings. Golconda flourished as a trade center of large diamonds, known as Golconda diamonds. It has produced some of the world's most famous diamonds, including the Koh-i-Noor, one of the largest cut diamonds in the world. This is a glass replica of it, because the actual Koh-i-Noor is literally a jewel in the British crown. After India gained independence in 1947, the Nizam of Hyderabad, Mir Osman Ali Khan, the world's richest man of his time, declared his intention to remain independent rather than become part of the Indian Union. The Hyderabad State Congress began to agitate against him with the support of the Indian National Congress and Communist Party of India, and in 1948 the Indian Army invaded Hyderabad, and he ended up surrendering to the Indian Union, signing an instrument of accession which made him a princely governor of Hyderabad until October 31st of 1956. Then on November 1st of 1956, Hyderabad was split into 3 parts and merged into neighboring states. Eventually, the Telangana state, of which Hyderabad is the capital, was formed on June 2nd of 2014. As always, there's so much more, but this gives you the idea. While I can't say with certainty that all of this is what actually happened, because we've been lied to about everything, I can say with certainty that it is what the historical narrative tells us happened, minus a lot of detail. The history we have been given is filled with details, so many details that it will make your head spin. It's almost as if the controllers are trying to convince us of the validity of their reset narrative by how detailed it is. The issue is not the number of details. The issue is that the physical evidence provided by the incredible infrastructure of the ancient advanced Moorish civilization, not only of India but all over the world, tells us a completely different story from what the controllers have told us to believe about them bringing in everything in existence. But I will say that the official narrative does clearly show how the theft of India and the legacy of the Mughal Empire was accomplished, and how its people have been extremely regressed from what they once were. Lastly, there are 2 points of information related to the British East India Company and the present day that I would like to bring up. The first is the flag of the British East India Company on the top left, and its resemblance to the flag of the United States on the bottom right. The second is that, like the British East India Company, the nickname for the CIA is also the company. Coincidences or not? Points to ponder.